The European Union has survived wars, economic collapses, and political earthquakes. It outlasted dictators, defeated populists, and absorbed rebellions from its eastern flank for decades. But right now, inside the marble corridors of Brussels, something is happening that no one in the Commission ever prepared for, and the silence from the top is deafening. Peter Magyar is not protesting the system. He is not marching in the streets. He is not writing angry manifestos. He is sitting inside the European Parliament, learning every rule, every mechanism, every legal instrument the EU ever built, and he is turning them, one by one, like weapons, directly against the people who wrote them. Ursula von der Leyen built her legacy on controlling Hungary. She never built a plan for this. For years, the European Union operated on a simple assumption. Hungary was Viktor Orban, and Viktor Orban was Hungary. If you wanted to understand what Budapest was doing, you watched one man, monitored one government, tracked one ruling party. Fidesz was the problem, Orban was the problem, and Brussels believed, genuinely, institutionally, with the full confidence of its bureaucratic machinery, that the moment Orban's grip weakened, Hungary would naturally drift back toward European norms, fall back into alignment, and the long, exhausting standoff between Budapest and Brussels would quietly dissolve. That assumption is now in ruins. And the man responsible for demolishing it is someone the Commission catastrophically underestimated from the very beginning. Peter Magyar entered Hungarian politics not as a career politician, not as a Brussels-approved opposition figure, not as the hand-picked alternative that Western Europe had quietly been hoping would emerge from the ruins of the Hungarian liberal left. He came from inside the system, from the intimate inner circle of Fidesz itself. His former wife, Judit Varga, served as Hungary's Minister of Justice. Magyar himself moved in the social and professional world of Hungary's ruling elite for years. He understood, from direct personal experience, exactly how the machine worked, how favours were exchanged, how loyalty was rewarded, how dissent was suffocated, and how European institutions were simultaneously exploited for funding and publicly mocked as foreign interference. He did not guess at these mechanisms. He lived inside them. And when he broke with that world in early 2024, he did not simply walk away. He walked straight toward a microphone and he started talking. What followed was unlike anything Hungarian opposition politics had produced in over a decade. Magyar released audio recordings. He made specific, documented allegations. He stood in freezing temperatures in front of enormous crowds in Budapest and delivered speeches that did not sound like typical opposition rhetoric. Vague, hopeful, carefully hedged. They sounded like prosecutorial briefs. He named names. He cited specific incidents. He described, with the precision of someone who had been in the room, exactly how power operated behind the polished facade of Hungary's self-described illiberal democracy. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Within weeks, a political movement materialised around him that the established Hungarian opposition, years of effort, millions in funding, countless failed campaigns, had utterly failed to build. Brussels watched this with cautious optimism at first. A new opposition figure, large crowds, credible allegations against Orban's inner circle. On the surface, this looked like exactly the kind of organic democratic renewal the EU had been hoping for. But the Commission made a critical error in those early weeks. The same error they had been making about Hungary for years. They assumed Magyar was simply the next version of what had come before. Another liberal reformer. Another pro-EU voice who would, once in power, gratefully align with Brussels on every major policy question and allow the relationship to normalise. They began mentally categorising him before they had actually listened to what he was saying. What they failed to process, what the Commission's political analysts either missed or chose not to elevate, was that Magyar was not running a campaign based on loving Brussels. He was running a campaign based on something far more potent and far more destabilising to the existing order. He was arguing that both Orban and the Brussels establishment had failed ordinary Hungarians, and that a genuinely sovereign, genuinely democratic Hungary needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, on Hungarian terms, not German terms, not French terms, and not on the terms dictated by the political families that had controlled the European Parliament for generations. This was not the message Brussels had ordered, and for an institution accustomed to scripting its own solutions, that made Magyar something far more complicated than an ally. By the time the European Parliament elections of June 2024 arrived, Magyar's TISA party achieved something that defied nearly every projection from established political forecasters. Running for the first time, with a party that was months old, against an incumbent government with complete control of state media and an electoral system carefully engineered over years to disadvantage challengers, Tisza captured approximately 30% of the Hungarian vote. Fidesz won, but the margin had been compressed in a way that sent visible tremors through Budapest's political establishment. More importantly, Magyar himself arrived in Brussels as a member of the European Parliament, with a platform, with immunity, with institutional access, and with an audience that now extended far beyond Hungary's borders. And this is where the story stops being about Hungarian domestic politics and starts being about something that genuinely frightens the architects of the European project. Because Magyar did not arrive in the European Parliament as a grateful newcomer ready to be mentored by the established centre-right or the socialists or the liberal Renew bloc. He arrived as someone who had studied the institution with the same cold, analytical precision he had applied to understanding Fidesz, and who understood, with absolute clarity, that the European Parliament was not merely a forum for speeches, it was a legal and political instrument, and he intended to use it. The rules of the European Parliament are extraordinarily powerful when wielded by someone who understands them completely. Committee assignments, parliamentary questions, formal investigations, budget scrutiny, intergroup coalitions, these are not merely procedural formalities. In the hands of a skilled operator, they are mechanisms capable of generating enormous political pressure, forcing responses from the Commission, creating international media cycles, and most critically, building the kind of documented, institutional record that can survive governments, outlast news cycles, and eventually form the foundation of legal consequences. Magyar had watched Orbán use procedural mastery to obstruct Brussels for years. He had learnt the lesson, he was now applying it in reverse, and the target was no longer just Fidesz. Could it be that the European Commission, in its desperation to end the Orbán era, accidentally created the conditions for something it cannot control, and far cannot contain? When Peter Magyar walked into the European Parliament chamber for the first time as an elected representative, the institution's senior figures made a calculation that would prove to be one of the most consequential political miscalculations in recent European history. They assumed he would need them. They assumed that a first-time MEP from a mid-sized Eastern European country, leading a party with no established alliances, no decades-long relationships with the major European political families, and no inherited institutional muscle, would naturally gravitate toward one of the dominant blocs, would seek mentorship, would trade political loyalty for committee access, would gradually be absorbed into the existing architecture of European parliamentary power, the way so many ambitious newcomers had been absorbed before him. They were wrong on every single count. Magyar did not spend his early weeks in Brussels networking at receptions and building goodwill with faction leaders. He spent them reading, not speeches, not position papers, not the carefully curated briefing documents that the Parliament's administrative machine produces for new members. He read the actual legal texts, the rules of procedure, the committee mandates, the precise language of the EU's rule of law mechanisms, the very instruments that Brussels had spent years trying, and largely failing, to deploy effectively against Orbán's Hungary. He read the financial regulations governing EU cohesion funds. He studied the European Public Prosecutor's Office, its jurisdiction, its limitations, and critically, the specific procedural pathways through which a member of the European Parliament could formally escalate evidence to it. He was not learning the institution in order to work within its comfortable, consensus-driven rhythms. He was mapping it the way a military strategist maps terrain before an offensive. The first major signal that something categorically different was happening came through Magyar's use of parliamentary questions, a mechanism that sounds mundane to anyone unfamiliar with how European institutional politics actually functions, but which, in practice, represents one of the most powerful tools available to any MEP willing to deploy it with precision and persistence. Parliamentary questions addressed to the Commission are not merely rhetorical. They require formal, documented responses. They create an official record. They force the Commission to either answer specifically, potentially confirming information it would prefer to keep quiet, or to deflect in ways that themselves become politically significant, because a pattern of evasion from the world's most powerful regulatory body, documented across dozens of formal exchanges, tells its own story to journalists, to courts, and to the public. Magyar understood this, and he began filing them at a volume and a specificity that immediately distinguished him from the vast majority of his parliamentary colleagues. The questions were not general expressions of concern about democracy or the rule of law, the kind of broadly worded queries that allow the Commission to respond with equally broad reassurances about its commitment to European values. They were surgical. They referenced specific contract numbers. They cited specific dates. They named specific intermediary companies connected to the flow of EU funds through Hungary's public procurement system. They asked the Commission to account for specific decisions, why particular disbursements had been approved, why particular audit findings had been classified in certain ways, why certain enforcement timelines had been extended in the months leading up to politically sensitive moments in the EU-Hungary negotiating relationship. Each question was individually answerable, but taken together they formed something far more damaging than any single allegation. They formed a detailed, documented, institutionally verified map of exactly how Brussels and Budapest had been conducting their relationship behind the publicly stated positions of both sides. This is where the panic began to set in, not immediately, and not visibly to the outside world, but in the internal communications of the Commission and among the senior staff of the parliamentary groups that had spent years positioning themselves as Hungary's democratic alternative. Because Magyar's questions were not only exposing what Orbán had done, they were exposing what Brussels had tolerated, what it had negotiated away, what it had chosen not to pursue, and when. The rule of law conditionality mechanism, the instrument the Commission had presented to European citizens as its definitive answer to democratic backsliding in member states, had been applied to Hungary with a degree of political selectivity that Magyar was now forcing into the open, question by question, document by document, with the full legal weight of parliamentary procedure behind every single filing. Sources with direct knowledge of Commission internal discussions describe the atmosphere in the months following Magyar's arrival as one of escalating institutional anxiety. The specific concern was not that Magyar was making false claims, it was that he was making accurate ones, and making them through channels that the Commission had no legitimate mechanism to shut down, because those channels were the Commission's own creation. Every attempt to minimise his findings, to redirect media attention, to suggest that his work was politically motivated rather than factually grounded, ran directly into the problem that his methodology was impeccable. He was not alleging, he was documenting, he was not speculating, he was citing, and he was doing it inside an institution whose entire legitimacy rests on the premise that documentation and citation are exactly how accountability is supposed to work. The expansion of Magyar's operation beyond parliamentary questions marked the point at which Commission officials privately began using language that would have seemed extraordinary applied to a single MEP from a party that had existed for less than 2 years. He began building a cross-national coalition of MEPs from multiple countries and multiple political families, not around ideological alignment, because Magyar had been scrupulously careful not to tie himself to any of the established European political identities, but around specific, concrete procedural objectives: investigations, audits, formal referrals. The coalition was not large by parliamentary standards, but it did not need to be large. It needed to be strategically positioned across the right committees, asking the right questions at the right moments. And Magyar, drawing on years of watching Fidesz deploy exactly this kind of minority procedural power to obstruct European majorities, had constructed it with an architect's precision. The budget scrutiny work proved to be the most immediately explosive. Through a combination of parliamentary questions, committee interventions, and formal requests for documentation under EU transparency regulations, Magyar and his allies began constructing a detailed picture of the specific financial flows that had moved between EU institutions and Hungary during the periods when the Commission was simultaneously condemning Budapest's democratic record in public statements and quietly negotiating the release of frozen funds in private. The numbers involved were not small: billions of euros in cohesion funds, infrastructure contracts, agricultural subsidies, and running through the documentation with a consistency that became impossible to attribute to coincidence, a network of companies and intermediaries connected, at varying degrees of remove, to individuals within Fidesz's political and business orbit. None of this was entirely unknown. Investigative journalists, Hungarian civil society organisations and opposition researchers had been documenting aspects of this picture for years. But there is an enormous difference between allegations published in a report by a Budapest-based NGO and the same information embedded in formal European parliamentary records, cross-referenced against official Commission responses, and formally transmitted to the European Public Prosecutor's Office with the institutional backing of an elected MEP operating within his full legal mandate. The first can be dismissed, the second cannot, not without the institution dismissing itself. And now, with every committee session, every formal filing, every cross-border coalition meeting, one question is metastasizing: through the corridors of Brussels with a speed and a quiet dread that no official will yet say out loud. If Magyar has already exposed this much about Hungary alone, what happens the moment he turns this same methodology toward the 17 other member states where EU funds flow through procurement systems with the same structural vulnerabilities, the same political connections, and the same historical pattern of Commission reluctance to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads? What began in Budapest is no longer containable within Budapest. That is the reality that has settled, like a cold fog, over the senior leadership of the European Commission. And it is the reality that Ursula von der Leyen's inner circle is now confronting with an urgency that stands in stark, revealing contrast to the composed, institutionally confident posture the Commission projects in its public communications. Peter Magyar did not simply build a political movement. He demonstrated a replicable methodology, a precise, legally grounded, institutionally embedded strategy for dismantling the consensus architecture of European power from within the very chambers that architecture was designed to protect. And the leaders of populist and sovereigntist movements across the continent have been watching every step with intense, studious attention. The blueprint is not complicated, which is precisely what makes it so dangerous to the existing order. Identify the gap between what EU institutions say publicly and what their own documents reveal privately. Use parliamentary procedure to force those documents into the official record. Build cross-border coalitions around specific legal objectives rather than broad ideological platforms. Refer findings to prosecutorial bodies with independent mandates. Repeat, methodically, relentlessly, without the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that allows the Commission to dismiss the messenger and ignore the message. It is, in essence, the European establishment's own accountability mechanisms, weaponized by someone who no longer believes the establishment will ever voluntarily use them on itself. 3 governments in Central and Eastern Europe are now reported to be studying Magyar's parliamentary strategy in explicit detail. Their interest is not ideological solidarity with his reform agenda. It is tactical. They have watched him achieve in months what years of street protests, international condemnation, and Brussels pressure campaigns failed to achieve. Genuine, documented, institutionally anchored accountability that the Commission cannot procedurally escape. And they understand, with the clarity that comes from governing in a system you did not design, that this methodology transfers. It does not belong to Hungary. It does not belong to Magyar. It belongs to anyone with the discipline to execute it, and the willingness to aim it not just at their domestic opponents, but at Brussels itself. This is the scenario that has moved, according to senior European policy insiders, from theoretical concern to active contingency planning inside the Commission. Not Magyar alone. Magyar as a prototype. The question being asked in private meetings at the highest levels of European institutional leadership is no longer how to manage Peter Magyar. It is how to redesign the system's defences before the methodology spreads, before the next Magyar emerges in Warsaw or Rome or Paris, armed with the same legal precision and the same devastating willingness to hold the institution to its own stated standards. And the answer, so far, is that no one has one. Because you cannot close the procedural pathways Magyar is using without dismantling the accountability architecture the EU spent decades building as proof of its own democratic legitimacy. The trap is perfect. And von der Leyen walked Europe into it long before Peter Magyar ever arrived in Brussels.